Yeah, I'm Nick Lewis, and I'm indeed talking about infrastructure as data, although there will be some code in there too. Give me this little thing to stand behind and tell me not to stand behind it. So Puppet generates a ton of data, or sorry, there's a lot of data involved in Puppet. Puppet does generate a ton of data, including catalogs, reports, facts, which I call observed data because they're just true. They're out there in the wild waiting to be found, compared to catalogs and reports, which Puppet actively manufactures. And it does that from user-specified data, inputs, your manifests, higher data, which includes all of your various configuration items, but also secrets, passwords, etc. And then your node classification, which is the high level what this node means. And so we can start with a common scenario. As a Minecraft addict, I would like time to be correct, synced on my computer so that I know when to stop playing Minecraft and go to bed. So that's going to be the theme for a while. So let's say, how do we approach this? Infrastructure as code is the hot thing, right? And that's great because it gives us this artifact that we can put in a version control repo. We can put it on GitHub. We can file pull requests and bike shed over details for days, just like developers. And it's easy to change because I just change the code and then it does a different thing compared to, say, I have a spreadsheet or a document that says how this machine ought to be configured. If I want to change it, well, I change the document, and then I have to go find an intern to actually make the change on the system, and that takes a long time. But it is still documenting. That's a nice thing about having everything written down in a document. But here, I can make comments. I can have history on a pull request. I can have a Git log. I can see why things happened and why a node is configured the way it is. It's one thing to see, well, this service is running on a node. It's quite another to see this service is supposed to be running on a node. And so we all hopefully are kind of on board with infrastructure as code. And it's repeatable because it's automated and computers rarely make mistakes that we didn't tell them to make. And it's similar to repeatable. It's pretty easy to make it idempotent, so I can just run it whenever I want, as often as I want. If you're using Puppet, typically every 30 minutes to make sure everything is totally in sync. But there's really nothing in there that precludes an example like this. So I want to sync time, I want to install NTP. So I'll install NTP, I'll check if my server config is in that config file. If it's not, I'll add it, and then I will start the service if it's not currently running. This is a tangible artifact, it's code. It's pretty easy to change because, again, it's code. I can do that, I can file a pull request. It's sort of documented. The code serves as documentation. By having a service start in there, I know I want the service running. And I could put comments or, again, git log. It's repeatable. I can do it on 10,000 machines and it'll work the same. And it's even sort of idempotent because yum install will just do nothing if it's already there. This is great. So what's wrong with it, though? I know it's not ZSH. I'm a bash user, so I don't actually qualify to make that joke. Yeah, it doesn't understand the relationships between these things. There's no error handling. So here's a little more sophisticated thing. We can do a check update and see if we actually have an update available, and if so, then install it. Oh, and also mark that because we upgraded, we now need to restart the service, so we'll set a variable. And then we can again check if our server is in the config file and add it. And this time, mark that we need to restart the service. And then, well, if we need to restart the service, then restart it. Otherwise, check if it's not running and then start it. And that's, it's now we're to a lot of lines of code, 13 on some white space. So infrastructure is bash. It works, but this still has problems. It's platform specific, right? That's not going to work on anything but a system with yum installed, and God forbid the NTP package is called something different. It's imperative, which is do this and then do this and then do this, which means we can't really reason about it very well. Or we can reason about it very well. We can't write tools that reason about it very well. Similarly, all the relationships are really ad hoc. I can see from the code totally that, that package and that service are related, and the config file and the service are related because I set a variable and then I look at that variable. But again, there's no way to introspect that. I can't. There's nothing I can do with a machine there. And even still, it's brittle in the face of failure. If that yum install fails, well, you're kind of out of luck. What happens? Do you go on? Do you not go on? There's not even a way to specify what happens. If that's what you want, set minus x, but is it? I don't know. You know, your ntp.conf might not even exist, or it might not be readable or writable. You could try to start the service, can't start, or it can't talk to the NTP server, etc. So we can abstract some of these things and have an install package that, you know, we can add some error handling there. That does the smarts of only upgrade if we actually have an upgrade available, otherwise do nothing. And we can pull out a function to add that line to the file, which removes some of that duplication. We can restart service, start service, add some error handling there. But, you know, it's still pretty much the same thing. It's slightly less imperative because we extracted things into functions, and so I can see, well, I want it this way. I want this file line here. The code still executes imperative, but it reads a little bit less so. That's kind of the only thing. But we did get a little bit from that, right? It's better. Why is it better? It's better because it's more abstract. We've taken pieces and we've turned them into something more generic that we can reuse and never think about the rest again. So we want to focus on the what we want to do and not the how. And so this should look familiar. This is Puppet code that does basically the same thing, right? We have a package resource, the file line that adds our server, an NTP service, and then we have some relationships, requires and notifies. So if the config file changes, the package changes, we'll restart the service just like we want to. And now the relationships are called out explicitly. We see like that this package is related absolutely to that service. There's no like, oh, well, there's a variable and they have a similar name. No, they're notify and require. Like, require is a pretty firm word. And because it's all abstracted into, you know, this is implemented by Puppet, we can assume that it's platform independent. We can assume that it's resilient to failure, or it at least gracefully handles failure. Whether that's true or not is a totally different thing, but we can assume it. So infrastructure as Puppet is the next thing. We're more specific than infrastructure as code, because we all like Puppet, right? This is, yeah, it's platform independent. Like I say, it's declarative. We've called out our relationships, and that's, yeah, not only can it handle failure, but it understands what those failures mean and how they might propagate through the system, which is the package fails, so we leave the service alone. And again, it's capable of handling the failure because we've made everything explicit and we've really let Puppet know our intent. And so the more we let Puppet know our intent, the more it can do for us. And so we can do a little bit better. We can pull this out into a class. Now it's abstracted, right? Because we talk a lot about wanting to focus on the what rather than the how, but this is still kind of the how. It's more declarative, but it's still, well, I need that package, I need that file line, I need that service. That's not the thing I want. The thing I want is NTP is set up. This is what I want, sort of. What I really, really want is magical time synchronization. NTP is just a side effect, or an implementation detail of my magical time synchronization. And I think it's important to focus on the what you really want, aside from all of the hows, and then find a good model that lets you address the hows in a way that doesn't get in the way of your understanding of the whats. So we have a couple of definitions here. Configuration management, I believe, is the art of making your monitoring checks pass. Because your monitoring checks specify the thing you want at the highest possible level. My time should be in sync. I don't want to check that NTP is running. I don't want to check that the package is installed. I want to check that the time is synced, which admittedly is approximately the same as syncing the time, so it's a weird example. But yeah, if you can't verify it externally, it's not a what, it's a how. And it is good to verify the hows. You actually probably do want to verify that your services are running, et cetera. But you also need to have this focus on the high-level goals that you actually want to achieve. Abstract what you want from how to do it. And then, again, develop a model that lets you talk about the two independently. And that is one, abstraction helps us here, and that's our other definition. Abstraction is giving a name to something so that you can cut it out of your life entirely. Which I can't speak from experience, but I've heard that's what having children is like. So in Puppet, we have a name for this abstraction, which you all know is the resource. And now, because we've given them a name, we're never going to talk about them again. All right, I lied. Resources are fundamental to Puppet. We can't get away from them. I don't want to talk about them, but they're kind of important. They're one of the basic units of currency in Puppet. But it is clear from that abstraction that we talked about, the thing I actually care about is include magical time synchronization. Actually, the include is an abstraction. I want magical time synchronization. No function calls involved. So because we know these are an abstraction over the thing we actually care about, and we don't really care about these, there must be more powerful ways to talk about resources and talk about what we actually want without going, well, I want this package and I want this service. And, so the more powerful tools we have for creating resources and managing resources, the better our lives are going to be. And so the other unit of currency in Puppet is the relationship. So we have resources and we have relationships, and we put them together and we get a graph. And Puppet ships out of the box with some 40 or 50 different types of resources and 2 types of relationships. You can see them both here. There's the dotted line and the dashed line. I think the dashed line is require and the dotted line is notify or subscribe. And that's kind of sad, right? That we have 40, 50 different resource types, and look on the forge, there's probably hundreds more. We only have 2 relationships. That's like if you wrote all of your all of your resources as execs. It's the lowest common denominator. It's these 2 things. Require means these 2 things are vaguely related in some way. Do this one first, and then hope for the best. And we'll get to that more. So this is we put those 2 units of currency together and we get the graph, and then we do more and more of that, and we get something like this, a giant graph, or something like this. That's how important the graph is. We're all wearing them on our shirts. I almost have faces. That's not true yet. Wait till next year. So if we do this at scale and we add colors, and then we do cool force-directed layout, we get this. This is the Puppet catalog. It's a complete description of the desired state of a node. Ostensibly, it's really not. It's the closest thing we have. It has a few things. It knows have this package, have this service. It doesn't understand that what you want is NTP, and it doesn't understand that the package NTP provides the service NTP. It understands that it's got to do the one first, and if it can't, then it can't do the second one. But it doesn't really know why. And there's no good reason it can't know why. So I think that we've traditionally had to focus on resources when the focus ought to be on relationships, because relationships obviously are an abstraction of resources because there's 2 of them. And so if we look at relationships from what we want to do first, very first thing, our goal at the very top is sync time, get time in sync. And to do that, we know we need the NTPD service, all right. And that needs an NTP package, and it needs an NTP.conf. And that's cool, but there's more to it than that we don't really talk about. And Luke mentioned during the keynote in reference to starting to manage compute and database and network and applications. We want to manage the whole thing. So it's useful to see what the whole thing really is, which is, well, the NTP package requires yum. I got to have yum to install it, and yum is written in Python, so I got to have that. Oh, and yum uses RPM. And if I'm going to have NTP, then I need an NTP server. And if I need an NTP server, well, I need a network to talk to it over, right? And, well, the package and the config file, they're being installed to a file system, so I need one of those. And this whole thing is kind of, it needs electricity. It's running on power. And when you get right down to it, at the most fundamental, the very basic, if we're going to sync time, we need to have the very concept of time itself. And obviously, this is ridiculous, right? You don't go, well, I need to ensure electricity so that I can sync time. You gotta put an assumption in there somewhere, and I've put it at that double black line there, is where I kind of think, below that, we can start saying, we'll assume that. But we still need, these are legitimate dependencies. Like, it's weird to talk about them, but you actually do need a file system, and you do need electricity. If you try running Puppet without electricity, it's not going to work. And that is a failure case that Puppet actually can't handle. So it's nice to be able to have a way of thinking about these that lets us, again, abstraction is giving something a name and then never talking about it again. I don't have a name for it yet. I mean, electricity is a good one. So it's, I think, really it's like the Carl Sagan quote. If you wish to install NTP, you must first invent the universe. Or, in the words of the Spice Girls, if you want to be my lover, you gotta apt-get with my friends. That's what I was hoping for. There are no more Spice Girls in the slide. I did not do anything to the Spice Girls. As far as I know, they're all alive and well. I was actually thinking of adding a DevOps spice. So again, this is all we got. We require and subscribe. It's a very sad list. And if you're paying attention, subscribe is the same as require plus a little tiny bit. They're fundamentally kind of the same thing. It's like I say, it's like using exec for all of the resources you ever want, because that's totally works. You can implement everything in terms of exec, because on some level, everything you want to do in Puppet is some action you want to take. But saying, well, my package requires my service, or my service requires my package, and my file requires its user, saying that those are the same kind of relationship is a little bit ridiculous, right? There's obviously more to it than that. And this isn't, there could be more sometimes. There always is, and that data, much like our pyramid, with the very concept of time being a dependency of NTP, transitively, is all still here, and it lives in the user's head. It's something that I have to understand. What does it mean when I say that the service requires the package? Why did someone write that? Well, that one's common, right? We know some of these. Packages install services. That's probably why that requirement is there. But what if it's a different package? Then I don't really know what's going on there. Puppet doesn't really let me today explain why those two things are related. And we have, file is, I don't really have a good word for it, so I say the source of a package, which is I need to, say, pull down this file because it is a package that I need to install. But all I can really say in Puppet again today is, well, this package requires this file. Ditto, users own files. That's a totally different thing than, well, the file requires the user. It's just got to be there, man. It's totally how the world works. A file configures a service, which that shows us the subscribe model, right? Subscribe and notify. We know that if the file changes, the service needs to change also, unless it doesn't. And again, there's no way to express that, which is to say, can the service handle us doing that or not? And again, that's something the user has to know. There's no way to tell Puppet. Users are members of groups, which that one gets especially tricky because depending on the provider you're using, that means the user requires the group or the group requires the user. Wouldn't it be nice if you could just say this? And files are the directory that another file is in. That has a lot of very specific meaning that gets completely thrown away, and all we know is do this one first and then that other one. Or a file is the command that's executed by an exec resource, or a file is created by an exec resource and is the command of another exec resource. And some of this is, the explicit relationships are nice, but Puppet has an auto-require system, which will try to alleviate some of this. So a file will automatically, if its parent is in the catalog, will say, oh, I require that, unless you've already said I don't. And which is weird because some of these are hard dependencies. There's no way around it. I don't care if the user says that this file does not require its parent directory. That's just factually incorrect. And right now, there's no way for Puppet to know that. So it just kind of goes on, and you can tell it, well, remove, or you can say, require parent directory, but make it absent, and then make this directory present. So files will also require their owner and their group. And again, they don't require that you're managing these things. They don't require that you're managing them correctly. None of that. Users require their groups. In some cases, again, groups require their user. Cron resources require the user that executes them, but we can see I don't think they require the command that they're executing like exec resources do. And exec resources also require their current working directory they're running from, the user they're running as, but they don't get a relationship to another exec that creates the command they're running. They don't get a relationship to the package that installs the command they're running. And there's no reason Puppet can't figure all those things out itself, or at least give us a way to tell it. Right now, all we can say is, well, this thing requires that other thing, and if you forgot a dependency, you're kind of out of luck. And so for now, these have all been handled really ad hoc. I just say, again, I can relate two things in arbitrary abstract relation A, which is sort of insufficient. And so to really drive that home, we have a file in some user's home directory, and we have a user. This is very common, right? The file requires the user. I'm calling it out explicitly because the require, Puppet will do the auto require here, which is nice, but we can see the file requires the user. This is great. User has to exist before we can make the file owned by that user. But if we change these ensure values from present to absent, now the relationship's backward. It's the same relationship. We said requires. But now it's totally backward. We'll try to remove the user and then remove the file, and that will work, but will be in a very weird state in between. And going a step further, suppose the file needs to be present, but the user is absent. This is an unsatisfiable state. We know this. I cannot have a file owned by a user and yet explicitly not want that user to exist. Not only is it hard to satisfy, it just doesn't make sense. But there's no way for Puppet to know this because all we've said is require. And so Puppet will take your word for it and will diligently make sure that user suite is gone and then make sure that file is present and owned by it, and then probably fail. And so we already have an owner attribute. What if we did something like this? Or if we did an auto owner, something. Which is, here we have a relationship which is the user owns the file. That has a lot of semantics with it that we just don't get from require. Now if I say present for one and absent for the other, Puppet can figure out what needs to happen. Obviously this is going to cause some naming issues because we'll have a lot of different relationships that are called owner, but that's something we can work out. And so there's no reason you can't do this in Puppet today. This is where I think the future of Puppet needs to be, is better relationships. It's really good at types. People who haven't written types, it's really good at types. If you've written types, you might disagree, but there are enough that it's good enough. Like, it could be better, but it's really bad at relationships. I get that. This is not possible now. No, this is what I would like, is when I tell Puppet that a user owns a file, it understands that the user owns the file, not that the file requires the user. One is a significantly stronger relationship. Because again, if I mark these as absent, then with the owner relationship, I know that the file is in some way subordinate to the user and that its existence is contingent on the existence of the user. Which, by the way, is exactly the kind of relationship that we can define. We can define it formally, that if A owns B, then B must not exist unless A exists. Like, that's pretty much it. And there's other semantics there, which if we ever wanted to actually implement this, we would probably figure out. And we can see from this that this state is illegal. My owner doesn't exist, but I do. That's impossible. Just flat out. We could refuse to do this at compile time. It'd be wonderful.
Theoretically, you could dispense with the ensure present on the file and depend on whether the user was absent or present.
Yes, absolutely. You could use this relationship to say exactly that I want the file to be whatever the user's existence is. Either they come together or they don't. But in some cases, it's useful to say that I want the user to exist and the file not to, which is the inverse of this and is actually possible. But yeah, absolutely, that's another sort of thing that could happen here. And so, speaking of incorrect dependencies, here we have the user and we have the file and we haven't specified any relationship between them. Today, Puppet will do kind of whatever it wants to. And there's a new flag in Puppet 3.3 that some of you may have seen. I think it's in 3.3. Henrik's nodding. Which is released. Which is sort of released. Which is a -- ordering command line flag, which will, in the absence of any other relationships, run these resources in file order, which is pretty nice, or manifest order, which is the user will be done first and then the file. And that's kind of cool if you're starting out with Puppet, because the way that you write your manifest, it's probably just going to end up working. But as we've been saying, relationships are really important in Puppet. They're kind of the keystone of everything. So I actually like this option better, which is also new in 3.3, which reverts kind of to an old non-deterministic behavior from before, where if you don't specify your relationships, Puppet will just pick randomly, which is a great way to find out if you have unspecified relationships. Because again, the more you tell Puppet, the more powerful it can be. And so I want to...
Is that a hash order sort of random, or is that a different every time random?
This is actually random. The behavior, I'm not sure if it was in 2.7.0 or somewhere in the middle of the 2.7 series, changed it from a hash order non-determinism to an explicit determinism based on a hash of the title. And this is now truly random, so you should get something different each time, which is much better than non-deterministic. I actually wanted backward, but couldn't get my way. So relationships are great. But beyond that, there's other things we can do with the catalog. To again, be more clear and explicit about what it is that we want from Puppet. Like here's a common example. I assume many people have used concat. If you haven't, you should. It's very useful. It lets you build up a file resource a fragment at a time. It doesn't make any sense, this example, because it's all right here. Why am I doing this? But if you have defined types that each need to add something to a file, because say you have a config and you have a vhost type that does fragments, you can put them all together, and this will lay down a bunch of temporary files and then run an exec resource to put them all together. And it's completely meaningless. All I see is, well, I have some fragments and I have a concat, and if I'm a user, I can figure out what that means, totally. But why can't I take the catalog and just turn it into this? Which I can. I know what's going to happen with the concat. I can apply some filter, I can find the resources, I can replace them, and now I can look in the catalog and I can see that's the content of the file. Try deriving that when you have 20 concats. It's no fun. But I don't really just want to replace those concats with this file, because there's still, again, there's more semantic information about where it came from. Nobody said, I want this file content. It's useful to be able to see that it'll be this file content, but I really want to still know where it came from. So I have some concat fragments, and why not say that this file was composed of fragments from those resources? I don't see anything wrong with that. Except that PuppetConf is too short. I missed a space there. That's very sad. So yeah, there's a lot of things like this we can do with the catalog that I think have been unexplored so far, but are fairly straightforward and provide capabilities that just can't be achieved with pure code. Like you can't do this with Bash. I can't know how to do something, which is the concats. Those are implementation details. But I also see the what that I want at the end. And I see the relationship between the what and the how. I see how I got there and why. All right, I don't see why, but I could add some comments and then I'd see why. Well, that's pretty much all I got. Questions? It was an abrupt end, I know. No questions?
So you talked a little bit about ordering manifests. It's probably a little long topic, but is there a plan to go to manifest ordering as default, or some other ordering other than like the hash ordering we talked about? default behavior.
So the question is manifest ordering intended to be the new default behavior? And I'm not sure. The history of this was it was intended to be the new default behavior, and then about a day before release, everyone freaked out and thought maybe we shouldn't do that right now. I made it an option, which I think is great because that's where we got the random order option from, which I think is even cooler.
Yeah, one wouldn't think backward would be that hard either,
Yeah,
as you mentioned.
Yep, backward should totally be possible.
Yeah.
I was told it wasn't, but I think I was lied to. But so I don't know what the plan is for making that the default. I know that it's been a sore spot for users for ages, but it also can make refactoring code more difficult because suddenly I move something from one file to another and now the order that it's executing in changes when we tried to make it more predictable. And also, again, the relationships are really important. We want you to specify your relationships, and that's not true. I want you to want to specify your relationships. I want there to be tangible benefits you get out of it. And until now, I gotta be honest, there really haven't been enough. And that's why we're doing this, is because the benefits to understandability outweigh the theoretical benefits of maybe someday being able to analyze this graph. And I think that the more we start to move toward more powerful relationships, the more you can actually start to analyze the graph and see, oh, I should really tell Puppet more so that it can do more. But for the time being, it's a lot easier if Puppet doesn't just behave erratically in one fewer way anyway. So I think you were next. Yeah.
So, like, Puppet's got sort of types of providers. I can write my own type, I can write my own slide. Do you envisage a world where I can write my own relationship?
Yeah, I totally think that. I like your shirt, by the way. It says, I assume it says I heart graphs. I can't see the G. All right, it's very good. Yeah, I would like to see, and I think there's no reason it shouldn't be somewhat possible today. We could certainly make it easier to write your own relationships and ship them on the forge. Because, again, a relationship is in many ways an abstraction over a resource because you can't just have a relationship. The relationship brings with it at least two resources, potentially more. And so I think that it's a very powerful concept. So yeah, I'd really like to see people writing types and also writing these new relationships. Someone defining what it means for a user to own a file and then putting that on the forge. Yeah.
Okay, I guess I'm a little confused about the point of this talk. So this is like a hypothetical proposal you're just throwing out to the community? And then the other part of the question
Yes.
is, what does this actually have to do with data?
So the data here, I explicitly didn't go into hire data and the report data generated data. This is fundamentally about the model behind Puppet and what makes it so powerful, but also the limitations, the practical limitations today that we can get around. So infrastructure as code is huge. Like everyone is doing infrastructure as code. And I think that obviously, Puppet is part of that. But I think that there's an opportunity to move forward and make a more powerful tool by embracing this concept of data and relationships and resources. And yeah, a lot of it definitely is hypothetical of, I want to get kind of mind share behind this notion that two kinds of relationships is not sufficient. Especially when you want to start doing things across nodes and in the cloud and elastic and I can have requirements that aren't yet specified, but maybe in the future, et cetera. Is that an answer? Yeah.
Can I I'd like to kind of challenge that. I think if you think of Puppet as a programming language, you want to have minimal, you want to keep things minimal. You don't want to introduce 100 different dependency and relationship models. Maybe you want more than 2. Maybe you want 3 or 4 or 5, right? But Ruby has hashes and it has arrays. It doesn't have Bloom filters. Right, you have to build those yourself out of hashes and arrays and other data structures. So I think that probably the better challenge here is to think about how can we provide enough relationship types that you can build either a defined type or a class or anything like that that can take relationships specific to the thing you're working on and represent those in something more generic that the Puppet core itself can reason about. So rather than introducing, an owner type that's specific to files and works in this weird way with users, something more generic that then the file type can implement its stuff on top of, and I can write my own class for, HTTPD or something like that, that also uses those underlying semantics to implement semantics specific to HTTPD.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's exactly where you get when you try to say, well, ownership is a concept, but it's really, there's a lot of different kinds of ownership. And what is it? It doesn't necessarily just mean a single thing to say that one resource owns another resource. And I agree that obviously we don't want to build 300 different relationships and then not be able to keep track of them. And I have an owner too, and a Puppet Labs owner, and all these different ownership modules on the Forge that define kind of different relationships that all want to behave the same. But on the flip side, I think that today Puppet is much too limited, even in its way to, or its ability to process the dependencies it has. For instance, going back to the exec example, execs do require their command and their file, or their command, their current working directory, their user, etc. And they create files, but those files don't require execs that create them, and execs don't require execs that create them. And we can't look inside a package to see what it creates. Even if relationship is our only primitive, there's still a lot more that we can add to Puppet to let it actually follow these dependency chains and start reasoning about the graph. And then we can look at, okay, where is require actually insufficient to model the things that I want to model? Because obviously, again, like the user file example, there are cases where require actually is insufficient. I don't know that owner is the right model. We may want something more generic, again, that is simply A must exist for B to exist, where require is actually A must be processed successfully for B to be processed. And we've talked about this in the future at Puppet, or in the future. We're really good. In the past at Puppet Labs, a metaphor I heard was Lego blocks for like an above and below relationship, where if a resource is above another resource, then the below resource must be applied first and must be present for you to be able to put the other one on top of it. And if I'm going, but that actually then is, now that I think about it, still ambiguous. The implication was, well, I have to take the first thing away before I can take the bottom thing away. But maybe I can just, if I take the bottom one, the first one might just go with it. And so those are, again, two different kinds of very similar relationships. And I think it's, again, it's a space that just hasn't been explored. And it's, I mean, part of this is very selfish in that it's something that I think a lot of, I'll say, alternate tools can't really express. Like, it's just, there's no way. And today in Puppet, there's no good way, but there could be tomorrow.
See what you mean. You could, relationships like provides.
Yeah, provides, which, do you mean, could you explain what you mean by provides? Because that's
I
another.
Well, your point about you have to do this package before you do something else, the concept that the package actually provides a particular file or something, sort of a little more rich than what we have.
Right, so that's another example is, services require packages. Extraordinarily common, but really the service requires all of those files that are provided by the package that go into it, and there's a lot of things in the package that it doesn't require, ancillary scripts, etc. Or, because who can get that detailed? Okay, service requires it's a init script. I know that by virtue of the service provider I'm using that's gonna try to run the init script. This package provides the init script. Well, that service probably requires that package. That's at least a thing. And that talks to another point of, right now you can't in Puppet talk about resources that you're not managing, like that init script. I want to assume that init script is there. That's, again, we need a model that lets us account for these assumptions. Because if I am assuming by writing package, service, and require, that the package is going to install the init script. And I don't need to have Puppet verify that because I'm very confident. Yes, it's possible I could be wrong, but I'm confident enough I don't want Puppet to verify that. Puppet still ought to know that that's kind of what I expect to happen so it can depend on it. Because again, the more information that's in the graph, the more Puppet can do for us, and the more robust the systems we can build. And right now, we give Puppet kind of the minimum viable amount of information to get the job done.
That's part of why error handling is hard too. When things go wrong, Puppet's just like,
Yeah, exactly, error handling, because Puppet doesn't really understand what happened most of the time. All it knows is I ran a command and it didn't work. Oh.
So, if you had a call to action for everybody today, what would that be like? Are you asking us to go and submit bugs, or are you actually asking most of us to go code out some new types and relationships? What should we do next, I guess, to address this problem?
So next steps.
That was the thing I was waiting.
Okay, yeah.
I was
Well, my next steps for Hemrick are a lot different. I want Hemrick to just go do this. Implement it, please. Because I know he will.
There's an armature called Puppet types, which is I think the beginning of this, because it all begins with being able to say, I have this type, if it's user, and it owns things or it doesn't own things, etc. Being able to express things. And that is what that armature is about. So if you like to participate, it's just starting. So if you like to participate, go read up on that and start commenting on, I would like to see this, I don't get that. So that's one thing you can do.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any current work on describing what these relationships are that you'd like to model? I mean, in object-oriented programming, we have the is and implements. In relational database, we have one type of relation, really. I mean, is there a list of relationships that you'd like to model, primitives, so to speak, before you start coding, these
Higher level
relationships?
things.
You need to be able to define them like Boolean logic or set theory. You need a theory of relationships.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's exactly a good way to put it, is like a theory of relationships. Not necessarily particularly formalized, but again, like, well, ownership is approximately the same as, the relationship that we have between a directory and a file contained within it. And we can generalize those and say, this is the relationship that means A must exist and B must exist. Yeah, so I think as Hemrick mentions, the armature for that, which one was it? Is there a number? Okay, it has a number.
There's only there's 15 or 16. You'll find it immediately. You go to the armatures repository.
Yeah, and
So
so,
Puppet Labs armatures is the project. And if you go there, you see a list of them with their titles. It's really easy to
yeah, and so that I think would be the best way to get involved if you don't want to dive into the code and try to prototype this. Because I think that would be great to have someone say, here's a proof of concept, look at this. But yeah, the next best thing is go talk about this and start looking at, go, what relationships do I have? Look at your own code and see, how could I make this more explicit? What is it? Where am I assuming that Puppet is going to just magically work? It's kind of a good start. There's a question over there.
So, I've heard a lot of talk about relations and requirements and all this. We've all been familiar with staging and different phases of the catalog runs. So I haven't heard you talk about anchors. And I'm just kind of curious why you haven't talked about anchors specifically in the context of order of operations and enforcing relationships.
Mm-hmm.
So is anchors a hack not to be used, or?
Anchors is definitely a hack to be used. Anchors is a hack around the problem of Puppet doesn't currently, and this is a language problem. So that's where I want to distinguish between the things that we can't express in the language and the things that Puppet simply can't understand. Because if you go make a catalog by hand that has class containment, Puppet can totally handle that. But there's no way in the language to actually make one of those. Whereas a lot of this relationship stuff, you could make some of the, but there's no facility to tell Puppet, or to even have Puppet understand what to do with it. But yeah, so class containment is simply, I have a module that is composed of, I want to break things down simply for ease of use, right? I want to have a class that manages installing the package, which may mean fetching some things, and then I want to manage the config, and then I want to manage the service, and I want those all to happen as a single unit, right? So like I have, say, my application or something. And then I want another class to depend on it, and I want those dependencies, I want it to depend on every other class that's included by that thing. And that's currently, Puppet can't do that, so we use anchors to set up those containment relationships anyway. And that's another thing that is currently being discussed probably as we speak somewhere, about how to fix that in the Puppet language. But for now, yeah, definitely use them so that you can provide a self-contained class. They're the best hack we have. All right, I think we're out of time. Find me if there are other questions. Thank you.